Good morning. Like I said earlier, I'm really glad we're all here because I really believe that the series we're in is one of those things that everybody needs to hear. The material we're going over has been covered in one way or another by churches all over the country. I think starting with North Point Church with Andy Stanley. But it was this idea, really more than anything, that Andy Stanley brought up, and it was the question, what do we do when God doesn't make sense? What are we going to do in our lives when we're walking with God, and we're following God, and we're pursuing Him, and we need Him, or something happens, or whatever it is, a situation arises in which God doesn't make sense to us, and what He's doing or what He's not doing for us doesn't make any sense. How many of you guys were with us for at least one of the last 2 weeks? Okay, good portion of you. Yeah, this has been the big question, because and the reason why this is important to cover is because at one point or another, if we haven't experienced this already, and most of us have already probably experienced this at least once, but if you haven't experienced this already, there's going to come a time for all of us in the future where we're going to hit a point where God is not going to make sense to us, and we're going to be asked that question in real life. What are you going to do now that God doesn't make sense? How are we going to respond? And so today we're going to be wrapping up, and this is honestly the most, I think it's the most difficult message of the three that we're giving. You know, my Pastor Rick and I, we talked about this, and we're saying, okay, who's going to take number 3? Because it's hard stuff, the way we split this up. And so last week we talked about when God seems late. When we ask for God's help or ask God to fix something or interact, and when it seems like He's late. We talked about Lazarus, and when Lazarus died and Martha and Mary were asking for Jesus to come heal him before he died. He was sick, and Jesus didn't show up in time, and Lazarus passed away. And the whole thing we covered is when God seems late, because it only seemed like He was too late. Jesus ended up coming back, and Lazarus was raised from the dead, and everything was all hunky-dory in the end, right? And so today ends up being a little bit more difficult. It's not as fun. And this is the warning I'm going to give you guys ahead of time, so you don't hold it against me when you finish and you go, hey, that wasn't a fun time, Nate. We're going to look at the question of what are we going to do when God seems like He's uncooperative. When God seems like He's uncooperative, when there's something going on, and we know that He could do something about it. Like we know that He has the power. We've seen Him do it for other people, and we ask Him to do something about it, and we believe that He'll do something about it, and He just doesn't do anything about it. What do we do when God's uncooperative? And so there's my disclaimer, because unfortunately, this is not a particularly fun message. It's not a feel-good message, but I really believe that this is going to create a foundation for us to be able to understand maybe a bit better the will of God, and to maybe a bit better learn how to lean into Him and to depend on Him in the middle of those times when He seems uncooperative. So first I want to give you guys a really, really quick story about when I was a kid. I had the privilege of being born in the information age, which means I got to use things like computers and video games growing up, whereas probably the majority of you were in your 20s or 30s or at least late teens when computers started becoming a commonplace thing. And one particular time, we had a Nintendo 64, right? And we loved it, okay? So my brother Canaan, who's back there, my other brother Elijah, we played this thing all the time. And we had, obviously our little sister Allie would try to get into it too, but she was very young. And one time she spilled a big glass of milk onto our Nintendo 64, onto our baby. And ever from that point on, it would have a lot of trouble turning on. It was very sporadic. And one particular time, it stuck out of my mind because we had some friends over, and we were like, we're going to play the Nintendo 64. And I'm like, okay, I really hope this thing works. Like, it'd be really embarrassing if you're like, hey, sorry, my N64 doesn't work. It's got milk in it. And so I tried to turn it on, and it didn't turn on. I turned it off and tried to turn it on. You take it off, and you blow on the cartridges. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. But you tried to turn on it a few times, it wasn't working, and I remember this because I was just, I don't know, probably 12 years old. I remember I plugged it in, and my friends were going like, "Oh, great! What are we going to do now? We came over here to play your video games, man. We're not going to be your friend anymore." Blah, 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 blah. This is what I'm thinking in my 12-year-old mind. And I remember asking God, please let the Nintendo 64 turn on. And I put my hand on it. I said, "Please, God, heal the Nintendo 64." And I flicked the switch. And it turned on. And so I learned from that day that God had given me the gift of healing electronics. And if you guys ever have any retro video game systems, you can take them to me. I don't do TVs or computers, so get that out of your minds right now. No, so I prayed about it, and I flicked the switch, and it turned on. I was like, wow, God did a miracle for me. He fixed my Nintendo. And so, you might be thinking, okay, well, great. That's a nice coincidence, a nice story you gave there. And so maybe, I don't know. I was 12 years old. Surely it could have been a coincidence. But all I know is that this thing didn't work. And then I prayed for it. And then suddenly it worked after like 6 times of trying to fix it. And you know what? I think it's neat, because what I really believe is that God can and does respond to us and interact with us with even the small things. You ever have one of those things where it's a minuscule, unimportant little thing, and you ask God for it, and it worked out for you? Ever experienced that before? Or like, God, please let me get a nice parking space at Walmart today. Please, I don't want to walk in the Florida heat today. Please, God, oh my gosh, there's one right at the front. Look, this tiny stuff like that, tiny stuff. And so it may be a coincidence, but I really do believe that God can and does respond to us in the small things. And so, great, that's a good, nice, feel-good story, but let's fast forward to today, 15, 16 years later. And so there's many, many, many things. I asked God for the N64, and I'm 12 years old, and he gives me what I wanted. And in those 16 years since then, I've prayed for many, 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 many things that are much, much more important than a Nintendo 64, okay? Much more important than a little thing like a Nintendo 64. And I've prayed about them, and I've continued to pray about them. And there are things that you guys in this room have been praying about for years, and you continue to pray about for years. Things that are so much more important than a parking space or than a video game console that God has done nothing about. Says, okay, does God only have the power to fix little tiny things? Well, no, because we definitely have seen cases of people having miracles happen in their lives and getting the thing they needed, and God has fixed the situation. But it seems like, I asked for the N64, God gave me that. And now I'm praying about something that affects my entire life, the lives of my family, my ability to interact with them. I'm begging, I'm crying out to God to fix a thing, and he does nothing about it. What's the deal? The job you're praying for, the financial situation you're stuck in, the illness, et cetera, et cetera. And there's things that everybody in this room you're praying for, whether it's right now or whether it was in the past and you've given up. There are things you've cried out to God for. And you believe that he could do it, and you know that he can do something about it, and you believe he will respond. You say, God, why are you willing to respond to something so insignificant and unimportant as a video game console? But you won't respond to things that really matter to my life, that the things that you theoretically should be caring about. And God, it doesn't make sense to me, God. This is a question I found myself posing to him. God, why? Why this tiny thing and why not that? Yesterday, yesterday, I misplaced $40. And I was like, God, please help me find it. God somehow helped me find that $40. I dropped it outside and it had blown away, but I found the two $20 bills in different places. Thanks God for the $40. But there's so many issues that are worth so much more than $40. Not just about money, but health and about family and about well-being that God doesn't seem to respond to in some cases. And we go, why, God? What's the deal? What's going on? I think many of you probably have a similar story. You could probably quote a thing. You know what? God did this tiny, insignificant thing for me, but then there's this other thing over here that is very significant that he hasn't done anything about yet. So what's the deal? What do we do? What do we do when God is just not cooperating? When it seems like he's just not cooperating with us. When you're a sincere follower of Jesus and you're following God and you're pursuing him and you're serving him and you're going to church and you're in small group and you're spending time with him and he won't respond to you on the issues that mean most to you. Today I want to discuss that question. I really want to open that up. And I want to look specifically at the Apostle Paul. And specifically, I want to look at one particular instance in his life, one dialogue he is giving about his own experience with God. And what I want to do is bring out 3 different thoughts about prayer that I hope will minister to you guys as much as they've ministered to me. Because happily, and this is, I think, the best position to be able to speak about a message from, I have been right there in the position of, for over a year, crying out to God and begging him to change a major situation in my life, and he has done nothing, and he's let me sit in it. And so happily, that gives me a little bit better perspective to be able to talk about this from. So that's what we're going to be able to do. And so here's that first point of the 3 that we're going to talk about based on an account that Paul gives you. And I'm going to rattle this off, and then we'll go into what Paul has to say. But here's the first point that we need to know about prayer. Number 1, we need to recognize that true prayer is not just about getting God to do what we want him to do, but that many times the process of prayer is about learning how to surrender our will to him. I'm going to say that again. True prayer is not just about getting our way from God, but it's often about surrendering our will in the process or in the thing or situation to him. It's not just about getting God to do what we want him to do. And I think there are some people who would hear that and push back on me about that. There are some people who would hear that and push back a bit. But we've got to remember that that's exactly how Jesus prayed in the garden before the cross. You guys remember what he said? He said, Lord, Father, if there's any way that you could take this cup of suffering from me. But then what did he say? But not my will, but yours be done. Remember that? That's exactly how Jesus prayed. He made a request. Yes, he's asking God for something, but in the process, he's also surrendering his will. And this is what he said. When he taught us how to pray in the Sermon on the Mount with the Lord's Prayer, this is what he said. He said, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Remember that? Thy will be done. So true prayer is not just about getting God to do our thing for us, but it's very often about learning how to surrender our will to him in the midst of the situation. And the Apostle Paul is going to have to figure this out the really, really hard way, in a really difficult way, but in a very good way, as we're going to see. How many of you are at least somewhat familiar with Paul? He's a pretty major figure in the Bible, and especially, obviously, the New Testament. I'll give you guys a really quick background story. This is a guy who hated Christians, hated Christianity, hated everything to do with Jesus and his followers. If you're sitting there and you hate Christians too, okay, but I guarantee you Paul's worse than you because he was persecuting them, he was dragging them off, he was having them killed. He really, really hated them. And he had a miraculous conversion, this massive turnaround in his life. And he would end up becoming probably the most effective individual for Christianity in the history of the world. This guy wrote the majority of the New Testament himself. This guy was responsible for bringing the gospel to the majority of the known earth in the first century. You read about his life, he was amazingly bold in following the will of God. He was amazingly bold, and he paid an incredible, incredible price for his boldness. Now, if you guys have read the book of Acts, you'll know that he was beaten for his faith on multiple occasions. He was shipwrecked on multiple occasions. He was once, and this is probably my favorite story to kind of encapsulate who Paul is and what he dealt with. He was once dragged outside of the city by a mob, stoned by rocks, and then left for dead. And when I say left for dead, I don't mean like, he's really hurt, let's just leave him for dead. It's not figuratively speaking. Like they were like, he's dead. And so they just left him out there. And luckily it was just dead in the Princess Bride sense, mostly dead. But he got up and he was okay after that. But this was a guy who suffered a lot. He suffered a lot, and I'm only giving you a little tiny snapshot of what he dealt with. He endured so much more than that, more than we can imagine. And so if I'm God, I'm looking down at this guy who sacrificed maybe more than any individual in history for him. And going, you know what, man? You've done your due. I'm going to give you what you want. I'm going to help you out. I'm going to give you a massive reward. You've dealt with enough up to this point. Now let's cruise on to on to heaven with you for your great reward. But unfortunately, that's not what Paul gets. That's not what he gets at all, and we're going to see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I think this is a very challenging portion of Scripture for those of us who know what Paul went through and what he did for God and just how committed to God he was and just how much he sacrificed. But here's what he says in chapter 12, verse 7. Paul's talking to a church that he was close with, and he says this. He says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me." Now, I think this is a challenging text because he's saying here, Satan put something in his life that was painful, that tormented him, and God allowed it. God allowed it. And not only did God allow it, but God used it to keep him from becoming conceited. And now he has this thorn in his life. Now, if you're wondering what he means, he's not talking about a literal thorn. He's talking about some kind of other thing that tormented him. And if you're wondering what it is, I couldn't tell you, because there's really nobody that knows with certainty what in the world he dealt with. And scholars have debated that for years, and everybody has their guess. And what is it? We don't know, but we know it was agonizing. We know it tormented him. And so people wonder, and they guess a lot. Most scholars believe it was some kind of physical ailment, possibly recurring epilepsy, possibly headaches or malaria, or even bad eyesight, or a speech impediment, or anything like that, for various reasons. But whatever it is, we know, he says, it was given to me. It was given to me, and God allowed it, and it torments me. I'm tormented by this thing, and God is using it anyway to keep me from becoming conceited. And now many of you are sitting there, and if you take this idea of the thorn, and this is an important piece of imagery here. Many of you, probably all of you, have some kind of thorn in your life right now. Maybe it is your boss. Maybe it's another person in your family. Maybe you're sitting beside that person. Don't glance over at them right now if that's the case. Don't want to give it away. Maybe it's the health issue you've been praying about. Maybe it's headaches. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's a sleep issue. Maybe there are just circumstances in your life that you're asking God to fix, and he hasn't done anything about it. But whatever it is, it's that thing that you're saying, God, please change that. Please change that, God. And he isn't. Because this is what Paul is experiencing. And before we go on in just a second, we have to remember that prayer is not just about getting God to do what we want him to do. But it's very, very often about surrendering our will in the middle of the situation to him. And saying, God, you know what? Even though I really, really wish that you were fixing this and not allowing it to continue, I'm going to trust you in the middle of what I can see and what I can't see, and what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing in the middle of the situation. And that's going to bring us really quickly to the second point we want to look at this morning. And this is something that really ministers to me and has ministered to me a lot in the last year, and that's this. Prayer reminds us that we are not in control. And prayer is something that keeps us close to God, who's the one who is in control. Prayer should remind us that we can't control every situation. Nothing will ever be fully under our control. But it keeps us close to the one being that is in control and is bigger than any situation. And so here's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8, right after what he just said. He says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. And so I love this statement because, you read the first part about how he had this thorn. It was tormenting, and we're like, okay, sure, but you're a superhuman being, Paul. And he's like, I had this thorn, and man, I loved it, and it was great. I love this pain that God has given me. Praise God for this horrible, tormenting pain that he's using to keep me from becoming conceited. But the next verse over, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. And now we're not talking about 3 individual times, like he prayed once in the morning and once at lunch and then once in the evening. We're talking about 3 major seasons of focused, intentional, intercessory prayer, crying out to God to take this thing away from him. Now, this is Paul asking, okay? This is Paul asking, and we know what Paul's history is like. And he's crying out to God to remove this thing from his life. God, please, if there's anybody who God owes a yes to, it's got to be Paul, right? Surely. And I've experienced this exact thing, and this is why I really, this whole concept resonates with me a lot, because the last year of my life, God has allowed my life to be arranged in such a way that I've had a very, very difficult time being there for my family. And I've had to work 3 jobs and be away from them, and it's been very hard on them, it's been very hard on me, and I'm looking at it going, this is not good for me, and it's not good for them. God, why are you allowing this to happen? And so I've kind of bobbed back and forth between this state of, okay, you know what, God, I trust you in the midst of all this. It's hard, it's hard on my family, I want to be out of this, but I trust you. And then things would hit a wall, and I would hit my knees, and for a week straight, I would do what Paul did. And I would cry out to God, God, please change something. I know you can. I know you have the ability to fix this. Please fix it. It would be easy for you. Fix it. And he didn't do anything. And maybe you're in that spot right now. Maybe you're right there right now. Maybe something is going on and you're crying out to God to fix it, or to make it okay, or to make it all better. God, please save my parents' marriage. God, please hold it together. God, please take this pain away from me. This is negative. I can't experience anything good from this. This only hurts me. It impedes me from following you better. Please take it away. God, I'm willing to work. God, I want to work. This is not a laziness thing. I want a job. I want to support my family. I want to provide. Please give me the job. And whatever it is, you're begging and you're pleading and you're praying, and you're doing exactly what Paul has done. Just 3 times. The word pleaded, I think, is very important. He didn't say 3 times I asked, like, oh, hey, God, could you take this away? No. Okay. He's pleading. 3 major seasons of his life, he pleaded with God, please remove this from me, Lord. And his answer was no. He's saying, God, I trust you, I seek you. Paul, of all people, can say, God, I've served you with my entire life. I've sacrificed everything for you. I've taken nothing for myself. I've taken no liberties. I've given everything to you. God, I'm only asking you to do what I've seen you do for other people. And if Paul, of all people, this is a guy who has had miracles done to people through him. Think about it like that. You read about what he did in Acts. This is a guy who God used to heal the problems of other people. And Paul's going, now I've got the problem, and now you're not going to do anything about it? Seriously? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And so if I'm God, I'm sitting there going like, okay, there's your question, Paul. You know what? Sure. Of course I'll heal you. You're Paul, man. You've done everything for me. If anybody deserves help, it's you. You know what? I'm going to say yes to your request. I'm going to take that thorn away from you, and I'm going to rain down blessings on you as a bonus. I'm going to give you a 10% raise in your next paycheck. Like, I'm going above and beyond for Paul, of all people, okay? Think about it. I mean, through Paul, God has answered too many prayers to count. He's used Paul over and over and over again to do these incredible things, these incredible miracles. And surely God can help Paul out just a little bit with this one thing, right? Surely. Paul begs, and he cries out to God. And what does God say in verse 9? He says, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. I don't know about you, but I read that and I get chills down my spine. My grace is sufficient for you. So, God, please do this one thing for me. Maybe it's Paul, maybe it's you, maybe it's me. God, please do this one thing. It'd be easy for you to fix it. It'd be easy for you to give me a way out. God, please. God, I could serve you more effectively if you did this for me. I could be a better follower of Christ. I could be a better father. I could be a better husband. I could be a better employee, a better Christian, if you helped me with this one little thing. And God says, no, not that one. Not that one, because I want my grace to be enough for you in that area. And we go, wait a minute, what does that mean? Grace? Grace is one of those Christianese words, that we throw around a lot. Grace, okay, well, grace means grace for forgiveness of sins, right? So grace, like we're saved by grace, good. But grace is a lot more than that. Grace is a core concept of the Christian faith. It's a core concept of what Jesus Christ represents. And so this particular word, the Greek word for grace here, is used 155 times in the New Testament. It's a recurring theme over and over and over again. And here's what it means: undeserved favor. Undeserved favor. Maybe perhaps my favorite definition or explanation of what this means from one particular scholar is this. He said, grace is when God freely extends himself, leaning and reaching to us because he is disposed to bless and be near us. I'm going to read that again. I want you to think about it and feel it and imagine it. You say, what is grace? Grace is when God freely extends himself to us, leaning to us and reaching to us because he is disposed to bless and be near us. And here's what happens. We tend to do this. We tend to say, God, this is what I need. I know my life. I know my needs. And this is what I need. This is what I want. This is what I need. And if I had this, this is what I need to make everything work okay, to make everything better, to fix it all. I need this. And God will sometimes say, no, that's not what you need right here. What you need is for me to be enough in this spot. What you need is for me to be sufficient, because my grace is what you need right in this particular area. You need my grace. It's the leaning in of God, where you ask him a question and you cry out and you beg like Paul did. And he said, I could do that. He's got the power to do that. He says, I could do that. But here, I want you to experience me in a way that you couldn't have if I say yes to your request right now. That makes sense? I'm going to try explaining it in a few different ways. It's the reaching presence of God. It's so hard to explain. It's something you almost have to experience before it hits. Just think about it like this. You have a father and you have a son, and the son is playing outside, and the father's watching him, and the son falls, and he breaks his femur. Imagine that. I don't know if you guys know anything about physiology, but it's said that breaking the femur is one of the most intense pains you can possibly feel as a human being. And so the son is in agony, and he's crying and he's screaming, and the father is racing him to the hospital. And the son is sitting in the hospital bed, and they say, we've got to operate in the next morning. And the son is scared, and he's in incredible pain, and the father is sitting over him. What does the father do? Tell you what, the father is going to crawl into bed with the son, and he's going to hold him, and he's going to hold him as close as he can, and he's going to say, I love you, son. I love you. I love you. I love you. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. And you know what's interesting? The son could not experience that side of the father outside of that situation. Isn't that interesting? That kind of reaching in of the father, that kind of invasive love and presence, the leaning in fatherly love. I'm here for you. I'm here for you. I love you. I love you. Is that hitting yet? That's grace. That's what grace is. And you know what? I really believe that sometimes God is like that. I really think that sometimes that God wants to be a blessing to you, and God wants to say yes to every request you can ever ask of him. He wants to. But sometimes you're going to hit a case where he says, you know what? In this particular case, I want you to experience me in a way that you could not experience me otherwise. Right here, I want my grace to be sufficient for you. See, I could do what you're asking me to do. That's what's so hard about this particular idea. That's why this is not a fun message. Because God could. Anything you ask of him, he could. But often, sometimes, he says, in this case, for reasons you may not understand now or ever, I want my grace to be enough for you. I want my presence to be enough for you. And this has been my very difficult experience in the last year, because I'm just waking up before my children are awake, and leaving for work and then getting back with an hour to spare before they go to bed, seeing them very little and watching them grow up away from me, my 3-year-old and my 1-year-old, and suffering and crying out to God and saying, please fix this, please fix this. I came to the crossroads where I had to say, either I give up on God or I'm going to lean into him and accept his presence to be enough for me in the middle of all this. Not because I was waiting on relief from him, not saying, okay, you know what, if I pursue God, then he'll fix my situation. But because the only thing that could get me through a situation of life like that, the only thing that did get me through that life situation I went through was the presence of God. And I'll tell you something that is 100% true. I have never pursued God as hard as I have in my life as I have this year. I've never been closer to God than I have been in the hardest year of my life. You hear that? And obviously I can only speak for myself here. I believe if God did not allow me to go through what I went through, I would have continued with a complacency that would have left me far apart from him relationally. Maybe continuing to do his work, maybe continuing to work in the ministry, but walking without a closeness to him that is necessary for every single one of us. And I think God said, you need to go through this. I'm going to let you go through this because there's something much more important than the pain you're about to experience. And I think sometimes God says, I could do that. I could fix it right now. But right now, I want my grace to be enough for you. And we've got to recognize that prayer is not just about getting our way from God, but it's very often about learning how to surrender our will to him in the middle of the situation. We've got to know that prayer reminds us that we are not fully in control of our lives, and it keeps us close to the one who is in control. It's the pressing in again and again. It's saying, God, I'm seeking you, I believe in you, I'm trusting you, and even if you don't do this, I'm still going to walk with you, and I'm still going to trust you. And that brings us to our last point here this morning, that prayer is not just asking, prayer is trusting. Prayer is not just asking, prayer is trusting. In other words, prayer is not just asking for what we want, but at the same time, when you're making a request, it's committing to trust God and that he knows what's best. And now, I want to clarify here, because what I'm not saying is that prayer is not about making a request of God, and it's not about saying, you know what, God, you just do whatever you want in the situation. Prayer is absolutely a request. If you come to me today and you say, I have cancer, I just found out I have cancer, we're going to hit our knees together and we're going to cry out to God to heal the cancer and to come down and to interact and to fix it. We're going to believe that the cancer will go away. We're going to believe that Jesus Christ is bigger than the cancer and that God does heal and that God does miracles. So don't get confused, okay? This is not me saying that prayer is just this is all on you, God. You know what, God? Here's the cancer, but your will be done, God. Your will be done. But it's both. It's making a request. It's asking for interaction. It's saying, God, please do this. And at the same time, it's committing trust to him in the middle of it. Because this is what James said. He says, we have not many times because we ask not. What the Bible tells us. Often, God doesn't do what we want because we never asked him to. So we ask, yeah, we believe, we commit our trust to him, and sometimes we see God answer. But there will be times when God is going to say, no. And so it's not just asking, it's trusting at the same time. And this is exactly what Paul did as we begin to wrap this up. You take what Paul's saying here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, this is years and years after Paul has, received this thorn and dealt with it for a long, long time. And so this is years later, and he's looking back on this thorn that he has, and probably still has, okay? This thing that has tormented him, and he's got a very different perspective. He says, there's this thing that tormented me, and God used it. And he says this in verses 9 and 10. He says, you know what, because of this thing, my perspective has changed. He said, therefore, I'm going to boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses. Why? So that Christ's power may rest on me. I'm going to boast about my weaknesses so that Christ may have his power come through me even in a more profound way. And then he says this in the next verse. He says, I delight in weaknesses for Christ's sake. For because of all this, I delight in my weaknesses. I delight in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. And then this last statement is maybe my favorite of everything he said so far. He says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. I delight in all these things because in the midst of the weakness and the difficulty and the hardship and the pain and the suffering and the thorn, he said, I have an opportunity to experience God in a way that I would not have otherwise. Like the son in the hospital bed, being comforted by his father as he reaches out to him. Because Paul has figured it out. He's figured it out that it's not just his successes and the happy times that draw him closer to God. But often it's the times where he can't do anything but depend on Jesus Christ that helps him to grow even closer to him. And Paul's saying, my ministry and what I do for God, my life, my job, my ability as a person is even more powerful now because God did not do what I asked him to do. He says, because when I was weak, I experienced his power in a way that I never could have otherwise. And Paul has learned somehow to delight in insults and in persecutions and in hard times. He's learned to delight in them because he's gone through that so many times where God says, okay, you know what? I know you're asking me to do something and I could do it, but not this time. I want you to continue learning how to make me enough for you. And he's figured it out. And he says, you know what? Now when that stuff comes, I delight in it because it gives me an opportunity to press into God and to receive his comfort and his grace as being sufficient for me that I would not have otherwise. And so what if you and I just tried to change our perspective a little bit? What if you and I said, you know what? I hate these headaches and I hate this pain, but I'm going to delight in it because it's going to teach me to trust in the presence of God in a way that I could not have learned otherwise. And the world looks at that and they go, how in the world can you delight in that kind of thing? How in the world can you not be miserable and not be giving up and not be cursing your God? You say, because of Emmanuel. Because of God with me. Because of God with us in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the hardship. That's what this is all about. That's what Paul's talking about here. And Paul has a changed perspective. And he's looking back. And maybe you're sitting in that spot right now. Maybe you're sitting in the midst of the situation or the struggle or the pain or the hardship or the insults or the persecution or whatever it is. Maybe you're sitting in it and maybe you hate it. I'm not trying to make light of it. If I was dealing with it, I'd probably hate it too. There are many, many, many parts, the majority of my life in the last year, I've hated. I've hated it. I wake up in the morning, I'm driving to work on an empty road because no one else is awake. I'm going, God, I hate this. I should be with my family. I put my kids to bed after seeing them for an hour all day. I come out into the living room and I weep. And I go, God, I hate this. I hate it. And I begged God to change it over and over and over again, and God didn't do anything. And so a year of that, and God's slowly beginning to bring me out of this period of suffering. And I've got one of two choices. I can look back on that and go, thank God I'm leaving that. That was terrible. God, I'm still a little angry at you that you let me go through that. Or I could say, okay, what did I learn? What did I learn? Did I go closer to you? Did I grow? I remember having a thought about 6 months ago at the apex of my pain and misery and crying out to God. And I had a thought that God stuck in my head. And he said, one day, you are going to look back at what you experienced and you are going to praise me for it. And I was very angry that he told me that. How dare you? But I can honestly say, I can truthfully say, with not even the slightest bit of exaggeration, that right now, I'm not clear of it yet, but right now, I have multiple times thrown my arms up to God and said, thank you, Lord, that you didn't let me walk the easy path this year. Thank you, Lord, that you let me go through it, because I am a husband right now that I never could have been without going through this year. I am a father right now with a level of valuing my children and my time with them that I never would have had without this year. I am closer to God now. I can speak with more authority now in my teaching that He's called me to than I ever could have without this year. And I'm thankful for God because of it. And you know what? I'm really going to start changing my perspective when the hard times come. Because, yeah, you cry out to God, and yeah, you ask God to change it. But sometimes He's going to say no. And what are you going to do when He doesn't make sense? Are you going to shake your fist? Are you going to walk away? Or are you going to say like Paul? You're going to say like Paul, I'm going to delight in this. I'm going to press into you. I'm going to let your grace be sufficient for me. And I'm not downplaying what you're going through. I don't know what you're going through. It's very possibly incredible pain. It's very possibly incredibly difficult. But what Paul has learned and what God is slowly beginning to teach me is that no matter how bad what you're going through right now is, the goodness of God is even better over time. The goodness of God. And so if God doesn't do exactly what you want Him to do, it doesn't make God any less. It makes Him even more God. It makes Him even better. It makes His love for us even better because He loves us so much that He doesn't want to see us continue in complacency. He doesn't want to see us continue sitting where we are. He wants to see us go deeper and further up and further in, as the great C.S. Lewis put it. That's what He wants to see from us. And so we continue asking, and we continue crying out to God and praying for miracles and asking, but we don't just ask, we trust at the same time. So as we wrap up, as the band begins to come up here, the question here is, do you have a thorn in your life? Is your life your thorn right now? What do you got? Because Paul dealt with it and he cried out to God. He asked Him again and again, God, take this from me. And God didn't do it. And Paul came out of that process one of the most effective men for God that ever walked the earth. And by the grace of God, somehow I've come out of the last year better than I was before I went through the hardship. So here's the question. Is God allowing you to sit with a thorn right now? And what are you going to do? Father, thank you that you love us so much that you're willing to even let us suffer to get to a better place. Thank you that you have a persistent love and a consuming love. God, I pray that we would take what we've talked about here and what we've learned from Paul this morning, what we've learned about the way Paul prayed and the way Paul learned to ask you for things and to trust you in spite of what he sees around him. God, I pray that you'd take those things and you would settle them deep within our minds, deep within our hearts. That we'd come out of here and whatever it is we're dealing with, because you know that we're all dealing with different things, that we would look at it with a different perspective in the way that Paul did. And say, this is hard, this is suffering, I don't like this, I hate this, I'm going to continue asking me to take it away. I continue crying out to you, God, to take this away from me, but I'm going to trust you in the middle of it. I'm going to press into the middle of it. I'm going to let your grace be sufficient for me in the middle of it. We love you, Father. Amen. We're going to have a period where the band is going to play here, one last song. And you guys can stand or stay seated. It's up to you. But I want you to take what we've talked about and let it settle in your hearts the next few minutes. This is a really good time to respond to God and to reach out with Him and to include Him into the thoughts that are swirling around in your head right now. If you're feeling that tug on your heart, if you're new to this whole thing and you're feeling God tug on your heart, now's the time to respond. Let's do that.